Contemplation on surfaces, its interfaces to the spirit. So it's very much, I'm talking about Rudolf Steiner's impulse for painting for the future. And usually people talk, when they talk about Rudolf Steiner's impulse, they will talk about mainly his colour lectures, and sometimes they will talk about his training sketches. Those are lectures that I've given quite often, frequently in the past. However, I want to talk today about surfaces because people don't necessarily talk much about the nature of the surface, and yet Rudolf Steiner had quite a lot to say about surfaces. I also have a verse to start with, sort of my verse of the year at the moment. The artist does not bring the divine to earth by letting it flow into the world. She elevates it to the worldly to the divine. Beauty is illusion because it conjures before our senses a reality which as such appears as an ideal world. Steiner goes on to say, consider the what, but consider more thoroughly the how, because the how is what matters. The what remains bound to the sense given, but the how reveals the ideal. So in a way, this quote by Rudolf Steiner from Goethe as the father of a new aesthetics sums up what I want to bring to you, this contemplation, this series of ponderings, but also learnings, which may meander a bit at times, but hopefully you will find interesting. But the artist does not bring the divine to the earth by letting it flow into the world, but elevates it to the divine. This is very much how Rudolf Steiner saw, for instance, painting. Consider the what, consider the content, but more consider how thoroughly, how you will bring the content, because that is what matters. Because it's the how, the way in which you do it, the process, and the medium and all these aspects of how, which reveals the ideal. So what is a surface? We all know what a surface is. A surface, from a pragmatic perspective, it's the outermost or uppermost layer of a physical object. It's the region of the object we first observe and with which other objects interact. And we tend to equate seeing the surface of an object with seeing an object. So there is this two-dimensional boundary between the inner and outer, and painting is very much, of course, a two-dimensional art. It's a picture art. In painting, we get the sense of literally, it's a picture of an image of something. Painting of a landscape is but an image of the landscape. Yeah? So it's very different to things like architecture and sculpture or music and poetry. It's very much lives in this two-dimensional world, the picture space. But what is an interface? An interface is a word we've become familiar with through technology. You know, the user interface is the point of interaction between a computer and human beings. It's a place where we communicate with our technology. And certainly when I was doing my degree on things which included web design, the creation of a website, the interface was actually the very last thing you created after you'd done all the information architecture and the coding and sort of built the insides of the actual workings of the website. Then you had to put an interface between the actual website and the human being in order that they could communicate through that interface. But there are also, of course, natural interfaces. And these interfaces can act as thresholds to other states. Anyone who's familiar with my work will know that I talk quite a lot about water. and that I will often show this image, which is an image, a capture of the movements of the currents through water, frozen in time, from one of those websites, those live streaming websites will show you at any time of the day or night the movements of the water air currents through right around the globe. And we see then this meandering, these movements, these dynamic threads movements, which are in fact in water and air, they're actually much more like, they're not lines, they are surfaces. And of course the Earth's surfaces are places of enormous interaction that profoundly influence the surface processes and our overall environment. It's very complex, you know, all the layers between, not just between water and air and earth and water and earth, but into the different levels into the stratosphere and all kinds of other scientific things of whose names I cannot recall to mind because I'm not a scientist. Not of that sort anyway. But the boundaries between what Rudolf Steiner likes to call the super sensible and the sensible worlds are also interfaces. The inner and outer boundaries, our inmost world and our outmost world, and these are threshold places, boundaries which in our ordinary consciousness we do not consciously cross, though we may come up against them. Things like meditation and the arts are tools, ways of, you might say, creating the portals through which we can communicate, or we can receive and become in some kind of active communication with the unseen spiritual dimensions, both inner and outer. Something like Goethean phenomenology leads us towards the outer boundary. Things like meditation and painting lead us towards the inner boundaries. So water itself is, of course, quite an extraordinary interface. We see there on the right an image of water that, you know, again, a tremendous dynamic, multi-stranded, multi-layered interactions going on all the time, of which we see here once again but a frozen picture of this constant process of dissolving and binding, out of which forms in the land and forms in the water are created, out of this constant flow meeting various resistances. So water is extremely impressionable. And this points to its intrinsic creative nature. It's kind of, I think it's Novalis. Is it Novalis? Is it Novalis who calls water something like the ultimate creative substance? Or maybe it's Theodor Schwenk who's saying that. Anyway, but water is certainly a transformative element. And water also is a threshold. You know, it's an interface. It can be an interface between the seen and the unseen. You only have to think of fairy tales and legends of the role that water often plays in the hero or the protagonist being able to cross from the earthly realm into a spiritual realm, such as fairyland. You know, the protagonist comes to a stream and they cross over the stream and reality changes. Or in the story of Parsifal, Parsifal going through the forest comes to a lake, and when he crosses the lake on which he meets the Fisher King, when he crosses the lake to go to the Grail Castle, he goes, you might say, out of ordinary time into a quite different space. He crosses in a threshold there. The water itself, in its dynamic quality, has this effect of enlivening our thinking, our perception, and bringing, you know, dynamic movement into our being. Anyone who's done a lot of wet on wet can relate to how dynamic movement is brought into our being just by painting with wet on wet for an hour. So what has this got to do with what I'm talking about? Well, it's leading me up to water, the nature of water in watercolour. Now, watercolour was Rudolf Steiner's preferred medium for painting, although he himself used a lot of pastels and chalk to sketch things out. I'll talk about that in a minute. But when people talk about watercolour, they tend to talk about it as, oh yes, the different colours, and people don't really tend to spend much time talking about the water aspect of watercolour, aquarelle. And the thing about watercolour, which I imagine particularly attracts Rudolf Steiner, is that the paint, a physical substance, a pigment, originally earth, elements of the earth like plant and mineral colours, when mixed with water and dissolved into water, lifts the physical element to a higher state through this transparent medium. So you might say there's a transformation of substance goes on when you mix your paint into the water. And for this reason, Steiner preferred colour in water as the medium for the vision for painting that he had for the future. Because in doing that, we bring something of a spiritual element into the physical, and we lift this physical material up to, you might say, a higher nature. And anybody who's looked further into meditation and contemplation also knows that working with water, when one's lifted into a water state, there's a certain loosening goes on in the fourfold human being, in our earthly being. We're loosened a little bit out of our earthly everyday nature. And as Rudolf Steiner says, then when we apply lifeless paint to a surface, we must get the light behind the surface. We must spiritualize the surface to create a secret inner radiance. And it's only by using paint in water that one can, and semi-transparent or transparent colour in water, that you can really get the light behind the surface. Yes, I know one can, particular artists are able to do it with other mediums, but this ability to get the light behind the surface and you might say spiritualize it, really lifts it to not only this other level, but kind of opens up what we think of the two-dimensional picture state. It starts to open up a portal or an interface to the soul realm. So when painting with gleaming water surfaces, to use Rudolf Steiner's, or the way it's been translated anyway in his colour lectures, when you paint with coloured water surfaces, of course, as I said, you're overcoming the image or the pictorial two-dimensional nature of painting to a certain extent. You're opening up this portal. But he also says, and he goes on, he talks about this at length in his colour lectures, the nature of image colours and lustre colours, picture colours and shining colours, Glanz und Bild, the German words, for how he describes the different colours. And he says that it's only by lifting image colour to this gleaming, to a lustre, shining state, that you awaken its essence, that you can go beyond the merely pictorial to something of the essential. So when painting with many transparent surfaces overlapping, then you're creating one whole surface of many interpenetrating surfaces, very much like, you might say, imitating water. So I create something new out of the materiality of the physical world, and then I can create something as an artist, as a painter, as a kind of interface to the divine. It's time for a picture. When looking, I particularly chose this one. It's a painting called Meditation by Beppe Assenza. Now, I was trained in the Assenza school, or I did short training in it. I don't think the current Ascenza schools in Dornach and in Basel and that would particularly recognise my current style as having anything much to do with Ascenza. But that is where I originally started, and then I went on and did other trainings, and then over the last 30 years I've developed my own approach. But I particularly like this one of Ascenza because of this image of the human being in meditation, in contemplation, opening up behind them in their backspace, so to speak, this whole world, this interface, literally this interface with the spiritual world. And there we see one of Ascenza's kind of typical spiritual beings, geniuses, inspiring beings, speaking to the human being there in contemplation. That's very much the theme that I'm looking at when I'm talking about painting surfaces in transparent colour as opening up these interfaces to the spiritual world. So I just need to clarify something here, and that is that drawing in Rudolf Steiner's approach is not painting. So many people think that painting is when you use a brush and you use paint, and therefore it's painting, and drawing is when you use a pencil, and that's drawing. But in actual fact, here we're referring to drawing as being working with the line, and painting working with the surface. Of course, it's very common for people to draw with the paintbrush. It's almost the first thing people do when they get a paintbrush and paint is to start drawing. But Rudolf Steiner is asking people not to do this, and he has quite a lot to say here. Some of it quite very straightforward, very direct. So, because drawing is basically representing something by lines, but in the real world, of course, there's no such thing as a line. And he goes on to say, talking to the teachers, drawing's really only of real value when it's carried out in full awareness that it gives us nothing real. It's a tool, but it doesn't actually give us anything real. It's kind of untruth because the line itself is an illusion. And in personal conversation to Genevieve, the artist who worked with him on the stained glass windows in the first Goetheanum, the woman who's responsible, you might say, for carrying out his instructions for how to work with black and white shaded drawing and take that into etching the stained glass windows. In a series of conversations, he's much more direct and says the outline is a lie. The contour drawn in advancement is enslavement. So he doesn't hold back on that. And in personal conversation to her. And then in the lectures to the teachers, then he draws this sketch and says, well, here is a surface of blue and here is a surface of green, as they might meet with the sea and the sky meeting. And of course, the line appears not as a line on its own, an abstraction, a one-dimensional object, but as a meeting of two surfaces. So of course, that's how one sees it in painting. On the one on the left, I'll put it into painting. It's fairly obvious. The blue meets the green and they create a line where they meet and edges. And this is when you then start to then take that surface over they overlap each other, then of course you start to get many lines, or what we rather call edges. So these are created, of course, out of the overlapping of surfaces. And of course then you can build up more and more and more, many layers. This constant building up of these surfaces, which are constantly, you might say, opening up this interface, this portal, to allowing something else to stream through. But before I say go into what's streaming through, I just want to go on a little bit more about the nature of the line. This comes from very much my artistic therapy training. When we look at the threefold human being, we see that drawing is connected to the upper body, to the head area, painting to the middle realm, and modelling to the lower body. This is one of those diagrams used in artistic therapy trainings all the time. And we can see on the left it says drawing, the drawing relates to the line, the one-dimensional, painting to the surface, the two-dimensional, and modelling the form, the three-dimensional. And of course we have our thinking, feeling and willing. So the line is very much connected to thinking, whereas the surface is very much connected to the feeling life. So for the feeling life, not just in terms of, oh, I have feelings, I like this or I don't like this, but rather feelings, or often that untranslatable word Stimmung, or what Kandinsky, the artist Kandinsky, says is actually something deeper than the everyday crude, his words, kind of crude emotions that we have, or what Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologist, the French phenomenologist, might say, those kind of, you might say, not those kind of everyday emotions that lie on the surface of the ocean, but lie deep in the depths. That kind of feeling. It's a kind of a higher level of feeling, of which quite a lot of the time, much of the time, certainly in everyday life, we don't tap into that area of what is meant by feeling here. So I just thought I'd put this sketch, this pastel motif by Rudolf Steiner called The Threefold Human Being, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Sometimes it's used on the covers of books. We see here in this sketch, which is faded, that the upper part of the threefold human being is just the head. There's this sort of, you might say, the thought, the thinking comes in here. The will area of the human being is this interesting little kind of sphere of kind of the modelling in the, where all this kind of modelling, sculpting of the will, if we exercising our will, and in the middle there we have a more developed image of the human being in this green area with this sort of opening up the middle realm of the human being. So taking that into painting, you can just see the little head of the willing human being and the predominance of the head in the for the thinking person, but painting very much works in this surface area. So as I said, lines in painting, in Rudolf Steiner's approach to painting, are edges. Lines arise out of the meeting and overlapping of surface, creating these amorphous forms that arise out of this interplay. These edges bring greater definitions to form that emerge only towards the latter stage of the painting process. This is the secret of this approach to wet on dry painting, one that I particularly tend to push in my approach as painting as a coming into being, a slow coming into being, where the forming only comes in the very latest stages of the painting. There's always this holding back, leaving the painter free from fixedness and certainty until the painting is almost fully realised. And this is, as I said, it allows for emergence. So it allows not only for emergence of forms, but it also allows for emergence of something to speak through the medium. So if you are going to draw, says Rudolf Steiner to the teachers, when using drawing, then you need to start with painting, working with colour or out of light and shade. So that's just an example out of some old paintings of mine of surfaces, obviously not the same painting, but surfaces that remain amorphous, which start to become more formed out of edges, opening up all these, you might say, planes, and then can become very, very formed. So it's not that one shouldn't work with form, but it comes back to that how you come to that point and the slow process of emergence out of which you work with it. Just have to say a few more words about drawing. This does not mean that one never draws lines at all. You know, we shouldn't be pedantic about this and say no drawing, no line drawing ever. You know, we must only paint with surfaces. And in any case, you'd only have to look at some of the paintings that I have shown you, or I'm going to show you, or that you see, you know, from various artists who've done anthroposophical trainings in one of the schools, that in fact you often see lines. These lines are, of course, are invariably edges, as I've already described, these interfaces where the soul world and the earthly world meet. And this is often very necessary for, I believe, that paintings using watercolour, using particularly in wet on dry painting, of which veil painting is just one approach, I find it necessary for compositional, but really to incarnate them. You don't want to stay out in always in luciferic, floating sort of colour spaces. It comes down to understanding why you're using the line and what it means in what you're doing. And of course, you'll also see it when the line is used then just to give a hint of a face. The real reason really for not using the line, not drawing with your paintbrush, but working with surfaces, is to overcome the innate forming, fixing tendency that we all have to immediately come to form, because people want to make sense. Now, in my experience of teaching painting, it is actually very difficult for most people not to draw lines, not to outline and not to draw form. It's to let go of that, to allow oneself to go into a state of uncertainty. And of course, as it says there, there's this human tendency to want to make sense of forms. You only have to think about things like the Gestalt principles, where you can, see a whole lot of dots and you want to form it into the mind, your perception, you perceive it, and there's this kind of trying to turn lots of discrete surfaces or objects into making something of it, yeah? Anybody who's worked much with wet on dry painting knows that at a certain point, often quite early in the process, that they will start to see things, yeah? Oh, a frog. Oh, I see a lion. Oh, I can see a girl with long hair. Girls with long hair appear a lot of the time, I might add. Or a partner will come in and say, oh, I see what it is. I see now what it is that you're drawing, yeah? People want to make sense of it. And it doesn't help, you might say, in a way, that Rudolf Steiner's training sketches are almost all drawings. Even though he himself did not want them to be used as drawings, but his training sketches are a path for the artists, for painting, bringing it into surfaces, into dynamic movement. One of Steiner's two sins in the visual art is both drawing outlines, which fixes things into fixed concepts, and copying. Just want to talk then a little bit about shaded drawing, because this is the kind of drawing that Rudolf Steiner thought was the right way to work with drawing, where the line becomes surface. And he goes on to say, works whose content take place in the soul should only be rendered out of colour. However, works that relate to what is spiritual, to what is of the nature of thought, should be created out of black and white drawing, shaded drawing. And I understand that he had hoped that to see his book, The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, in fact, illustrated with black and white shaded drawings. I don't know if anyone's actually attempted to take that on. So we see now that it's not that one mustn't use the line, but it's how one uses the line. And like when painting in surfaces, when painting with shaded drawing, you're always in this state of something is emerging out of what you're building up, the many, many lines that you're building up. There's always this element of the unknown approaching you. So that's just a couple of examples. I'm sure you're all familiar with shaded drawing, but many people don't realise that the shaded drawing is in fact that the lines should keep going. Yeah? All the objects in this drawing, which comes from, it's a drawing by Ava Mace, art therapist. All the forms arise out of the lines that become surfaces and creating all these little surfaces which then turn into objects. And these rather blurred images on the right are from an absolute master of shaded drawing, Gertrude Goodwin. The bookshop in Sydney used to have a series of 12 cards from her Zodiac series. She's an English sculptor and works with shaded drawing, and these are just two very blurred images from her astrological series. They're very blurred because she quite sensibly only makes what's available online that you can access on the internet are in incredibly small JPEGs, so that her images aren't stolen by other people and used without her permission. However, if one could just imagine this technique taken into this extraordinary interplay of movements as we see here, then one can get a sense that's all lines going through all there. So as I said, she's an absolute master of this work. So back to watercolour, back to surfaces in painting. The surface, like water, should not, when you're painting it, be flat, but it has movement, so it has this impressionable, very mobile quality to it. And again, in one of those little, what do they call it? Not conversation, anecdotal things that Rudolf Steiner saying to Turgenev is that he put up this drawing and said, well, you do not, when she brought out a picture of the Madonna and child and the child lying on straw, He said, you don't need to make the straw so naturalistic. You could make it out of these kind of etheric cloud-like forms so that one does not know, what it really is. I'm just trying to remove all the pictures of everybody out of the way so I can actually read the end of the quote. And he says to her, study the movements of the colours in the painting of the small cupola. What is around things? What is between things? What leads to the etheric? What leads you across that threshold through the interface of colour or shaded drawing through these surfaces? That is what one should look for. That is what one should aim for. So, studying the colour movements in the painting of the small cupola. Once again, I'm sure many of you have seen these many times before. These are, the one on the left, they are in fact, the one on the left is an artist's impression, somebody who was a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner. I can't bring his name to mind, Harold Rosenstern, possibly, yeah. And we have then a smaller area here of the motif of the fifth post-Atlantean epoch with Ahriman and Lucifer literally face to face, one the negative space of the other, which you can see just here. That's just a close-up. But what we really see, what I'm really, Steiner was asking us to look at here is this continually interweaving of surfaces, this overlapping surfaces, which he says is how we would experience the soul world. That is, not that, without this fixedness, without these forms that stay in static in the way we're used to, but something that you have to imagine is in a constant state of coming into being and disappearing again, and where everything and everyone, all spiritual beings, are in constantly, you might say, overlapping each other. And in the very few paintings we have from him, he tries to demonstrate this. And he says, there we have his painting of the metamorphic plant and his mother and child new life watercolour, which he painted in the last year of his life, 1924. And we see there this use, him finding his way with this creating something with these luminous surfaces that overlap each other. Now, Rudolf Steiner himself said about watercolour painting that he needed 30 years really to practice it in order to really be able to work with it in the way that he believed it should be worked with. Which basically leaves all painters in the position of saying, well, I may have painted for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, but obviously there's still more to learn and still more ways to work with, to understand this medium. So emergence, as I've mentioned before, is central to this what Rudolf Steiner saw as the use of these coloured, transparent surfaces. So when we think of the world, including the human being, everything in the physical world is a densification of something higher, something purer, of invisible forces. Movement itself is a process of constant dissolve, like water, bind and dissolve, bind and dissolve. One only has to think back to his descriptions of the Earth during, say, the Lemurian period, and where he describes the world as being in a much more plastic, mobile form. He uses a slightly unfortunate phrase, spinach-like, that you have this sense of how in the very, very earliest stages of human and of Earth evolution and the human within it, that the physical form, the hardened physical form, as we know it today, is at the end of a very, very long process. Where gradually form arose out of movement that cooled and you might literally say cooled and condensed and came to rest, rather like in the flow of natural water that you see in meander forms in a river where little islands are created where the flow is gradually, the energy of the flow is gradually cut off, and it kind of creates a sort of a static area of earth away from the dynamic central movement of the water. So as I said, working with transparent surfaces allows for this emergent quality, this coming into being. And painting in this way points to what is, what to the future, and to becoming, and to allowing for revelations to emerge out of this slow process. Whereas symbolic art, Rudolf Steiner says, always points to the past. It points to knowledge, to what was. Just a few more anecdotal quotes from Rudolf Steiner. See, I've got 10 more minutes. Better move on. Again, from these personal conversations in how to work. All this is in these personal conversations during the creation of the first Goethe Arnhem. How, when the artists came to him and said, but how do we work in these ways, here, Dr. Steiner? How do we bring these things? How do we make what you're telling us? How do we do it? He says that working with these unknown things requires an attentiveness and an inner activity. And it liberates you from dead intellectual fixed images. This is, of course, he's also talking about shaded drawing, as well as painting. It frees you from the head and concentrates your awareness in the middle realm. And he goes on to say the intellect is a bad dog when it comes to the artistic. Of course, you must have a thought, an idea, but then you just leave it behind, forget it, and only work from feeling. You never ought to know beforehand how the picture or composition will look when it is finished. You must wait for the composition and never visualize it or plan it beforehand. Everything must arise out of this slow coming into being. You must not try to superimpose your fixed images that you have in your head, however difficult it is or however enticing they may be. You must not plan that this is how you will form it. Just get into some paintings now. Some paintings by Beppe Essenza. I should have said before, for those of you who don't know, Beppe Essenza had a painting school in Dornach itself around about the same time as Gerhard Wagner had his school. I don't know who started first. For Beppe Essenza, the working with the coloured surfaces was very much had to be contemplated in complete interior silence. It's how he saw painting. Something, when we think back to that first painting I showed you of his, of meditation, it's something that you must have interior silence to allow things to emerge. And of course we see here these interfaces, these surfaces where edges appear, where other edges that then allow so openings up in different ways. And surfaces, of course, can be all different sizes and shapes, all different ways of using the brushstroke. There's no particular set way of doing it. It could be, you know, these very, very tiny little areas. It could be these long, more streaming areas. Yeah. And he else, you know, but everything then, just to show you something from his sketchbooks, is you work, you know, you start off just by working with colour chords and these working out how surfaces overlap. And he had all these sketchbooks where you see this over, you know, all these little exercises in what happens when surfaces overlap. Because he says when you paint colour surfaces overlapping each other in layers, in surfaces, you create temporal spaces of experience. It's just a building up from his sketchbook of surfaces that as they gradually meet and overlap, gradually his little picture arises out of this emerging process. Two of his that I think particularly demonstrate this approach: on the left, in temple; on the right, threshold. One is working very much with colours and black, the other one with colours and white. In the soul world, and then the threshold of the soul world where the surfaces start to break down and open up these spaces beyond. I wanted just to talk briefly about the spiritual nature of the arts. Art is a bridge between the sensible and the supersensible, says Rudolf Steiner. It's actually the name of a lecture by him, Art as a Bridge between the sensible and the supersensible. Or the sculptor Michael Howard says, works of art are vehicles for spiritual qualities. As artists, we bring these spiritual qualities into the sphere of human doing, of human life. By so doing, we become responsible for the spiritual elements of the work of the artist upon the artist, upon other people, and on human evolution. Michael Howard is an American sculptor who is, unlike Essenza, still active and alive. And then Kandinsky, painting is an art, and art is not vague production, I should say. If art refrains from doing this work, a chasm remains unbridged. For no other power can take the place of art in this activity, and at times when the human soul is gaining greater strength, art will so grow in power, for the two are inextricably connected and complementary to one another. However, at times when the soul tends to be choked by material disbelief, art becomes purposeless. We talk of art for art's sake. Then the bond between art and soul is drugged into unconsciousness, he says in his manifesto. So yes, we understand art is a bridge between the sensible and the sensible, the physical and the spiritual hidden world. However, it may not be quite so well known that the painting itself is connected to the experiences, as he says, we let flow into our waking body between falling asleep and waking up. In turn, what emerges in painting then is a kind of a reproduction of a supersensible reality if we are able to have made ourselves, you might say, sufficiently permeable to allow these experiences. So This actually comes from a very interesting series of lectures called Understanding Art. He talks about painting, particularly in the one called The Supersensible Origin of Artistic Understanding. But he goes on to talk about how different arts, architecture, sculpture, music, poetry, painting, eurythmy, all draw, you might say, on different experiences of the spiritual world. I won't go into them. You can read it for yourself. I'm only talking about painting here. But he does say that when working with the line, you are working with a memory of prenatal life. But if you want to paint with expanded consciousness, that includes the spiritual world, you must paint out of colour surfaces, because it's colour is what lives in the astral world. Colour in the astral world is not just a phenomena attached to objects as we tend to think of it in the physical world, but it is in fact spiritual beings. And when we work in this way, painting can then become a revelation of the spiritual world that surrounds us in space and permeates us from space. That world in which we find ourselves in between falling asleep and waking up. So quite different to the world after death and before rebirth, which he connects to the other arts. And I just thought now I'd show you some paintings from people in my Friday Masterclass series who may have kindly allowed me to show them to you. And they aren't necessarily finished, because I wanted to show paintings that you might say are people working with trying to emerge these coloured surfaces and allowing things to emerge out of the surfaces. In fact, these paintings come from a course I did last year on working with the threshold, all different thresholds. The threshold of falling asleep and waking up, the threshold of birth and death, the threshold of forgetting and remembering, these seasonal thresholds, all these different thresholds, the guardian at the thresholds. We worked with the lectures from macrocosm, microcosm. And I think we have here this is, forgive me if I get these wrong, people, the water to air, over the transition, the threshold from water to air, the threshold of death, crossing into death, the excarnation process, and the waking up, the sleeping and waking threshold. All these where people are trying to work out of these many small surfaces to allow something to speak through it. These are some other ones. Also some of them are from the threshold. The two on the right are from the threshold series, working with thresholds. Sorry, I can't remember the exact name, whether this was, I think again it was waking and sleeping. Sorry to the person who can tell me what it is. And these other ones are working with colours that are close to the threshold. Nothing coming to recognisable form, but really just constantly trying to work with opening up a kind of a space. I want to just say a little bit on painting spiritual beings. This is one of the areas that Rudolf Steiner talks about this, about when working with spiritual beings, that they should arise out of movement, as we saw back on the first Goetheanum, arise out of the interpenetration of surfaces. And he says you must imagine, these are sketches of his, that he did for the small cupola in the first Goetheanum. Faust's genius on the left, the Greek initiate on the right, that you must imagine these beings as arising out of these continual movements or these continual forming forces, energies if you want to call them that, out of which a countenance briefly emerges and then recedes again. So quite a different way of painting spiritual beings than the kind of conventional one that we are familiar with from art history, of where spiritual beings generally, certainly in the last 500 years, tend to all look like higher level human beings, beautiful human beings with wings and flowing drapes. We have a very different picture of how he says how to work with these, and then he gave these sketches then to the painters. And just a couple of examples of people, again, from my masterclass group of working then, trying to paint Lucifer. This is in 2 stages of the same painting, obviously, out of many, many surfaces, out of that same streaming movement where there's only a little bit of drawing at the outlining of eyes at the very, very end, but really one should feel that Lucifer as it is, here we have Lucifer and Ahriman on the right, because you can't paint Lucifer without Ahriman. The two always appear together. So Lucifer in this, he described Rudolf Steiner as emerging out of this constant yellow-red sort of turning in on itself, this face that appears out of this kind of sulphurous yellow-red. And then the painting of Ahriman, because Ahriman also, despite the fact that we think of Ahriman as being trapped in the physical world, and we see him in, you know, in the sculptures and paintings and painted in very hard outlines, nevertheless, still, Ahriman also emerges in the spiritual world, is a being of coming into being, of emergence and dying away, much more, of course, dying away than the Lucifer. You can just see the Ahrimanic profile emerging here out of this painting of black and indigo. And that's just a few more of people showing their process. I have all these photos of people's process because I always encouraging people to put up paintings of their process on our digital noticer board so we can see this emerging process. We have a Michael on the left emerging out of meteoric iron activity. We have the beginnings of the representative of humanity with Lucifer again as this great sort of movement about to falling down, and the Christ being which then comes more into form at the very end of the painting here. Just a couple more again. People working with how do I work with bringing spiritual beings out of the surface, out of the movements. Another Michael beginning to, Lucifer emerging. A Michael again more out of the activity of meteoric iron, and then a Lucifer. Not a pretty Lucifer either, but a Lucifer more expressing. You might say that not the beautiful higher being, but the being of overweening pride and greed and everything that Rudolf Steiner describes Lucifer as embodying in his fallen state. And then, of course, Ahriman created out of surfaces, just surfaces of black and violet, slowly emerging as the surfaces get deeper and darker and more layers over each other until the countenance, the hardened sclerotic countenance of him starts to emerge. Just a few more of Ahriman because I really like them. I really like, it's, Steiner says, yes, we need to actively paint Ahriman. We must not ignore him. We must actively paint these beings. So this is just other people feeling their way into the Ahrimanic energy of something emerging out of the fixedness and the emergence of an Ahrimanic energy or Ahrimanic activity out of the black physicality of the earth. And these two other ones also emerging out of these surfaces. And you can see that these surfaces are not necessarily the nice, beautiful, clear colours and forms that people very often associate with what veil painting, but rather working much more strongly out of the nature of black as the lifeless image of death. What effect does this have upon the artist? It has certain effects upon the viewer, but what upon the artists themselves? This quote from Rudolf Steiner: men living a constant illusion, believing themselves to be something separate, simply through being enclosed within their skin. Separate they cannot be, just as the finger can be nothing without the whole organism. We on earth are, in a higher sense, in the same position of the finger on our organism. So when one is painting, you can't help but have, as in any activity, how you do it, coming back to that how, has an effect upon the being of the artist. And one must imagine that if one works constantly with drawing lines and creating fixed forms, then this can have a particular effect on one's soul, which shapes you in a particular way. Whereas you constantly working with surfaces, trying to work with something emerging, something that is uncertain, something that with these surfaces opening up this interplay between yourself and spiritual activity, then this also has the effect of gradually making the human being who works in this way somewhat more, or often very much more, transparent in their own being. This is something anyone who's trained in the anthroposophical art therapies will know very well, how different therapies will work upon this loosening, this certain effects in the way they change our fourfold organisation. So with painting, you must imagine, just as with a eurythmist working for many, many years, shaping with etheric, these forming forces, constantly working with surfaces, that emergence brings one's own being into a very different inner space as well. And it will bring you into a different relationship to the world. So, just to finish, to go back to that image of the painter meditating working with the inner, a sensor's inner silence, opening up an interface between themselves and the spiritual world. The source of the artistic is the inner experience of the human being. The artistic arises out of inner contemplation and tries to bring to expression that which can only be felt inwardly, experienced inwardly, says Rudolf Steiner. Actually in a lecture about eurythmy, but also appropriate to painting. And I would just like to give some picture credits to the people who, apart from Beppe Senza and Gertrude Goodwin and Ava Mace, to the people who kindly allowed me to use their paintings. And that is where I will finish.